The place was stuffy when I arrived. A used bookstore. Old books lined the walls, stacked 10 feet high. Sweat was rolling down my back before the first handshakes were over. The closed air was spent and used up like the books. I couldn't imagine 20 living, breathing people crammed in here on folding chairs to hear me read. It was already stuffy, the air like a yellowed page. Coming to pieces when you touched it. Dead. Old and dead. But being here. Breathing this air. It was all part of the same sacrifice. This was what I had to do. A low kid's table was set up next to a tall stool where I was to read passages from the dog-eared novel that I held in a sweaty palm. Every so often I switched hands, but it wasn't long before the new hand was pouring new sweat into the binding. The proprietor was a middle-aged woman with very dark, very straight hair that made her seem young until you looked at her face. The years were waging war against her face, but her hair was as youthful and healthy as it must have been when she was 20, if she had ever been 20. Sometimes, even at this late stage in my life, I still pause to consider whether or not the dream began with my birth and whether or not there was anything real in the world before the moment when my eyes opened in the hospital. How could I know? I have always leaned toward solipsism like a cliched and meager houseplant toward a window. Trappism, they call it. She pointed me to the stool and I waited for her to explain the low table and the high stool, but no explanation came. I sat on the short little table and set my book on the stool. The dark hair was already moving away, busy on a last-minute errand or something, though it seemed she had all the time in the world. The store was empty except for me, someone who had brought a book to read from and wouldn't be buying any more. The hair versus face conundrum made me think of Fred Flintstone and his alien conscience come sidekick, Kazam, the helmeted 5-inch green guy that hovered above Fred's shoulder during some of the later seasons. They were divisions of an undividable thing, Fred and Kazam. The two were one. I wondered if Kazam would age along with Fred. Was Kazam really just a projection of Fred's psyche? Was he therefore ageless? Do our psyches grow old? Flipping through my dog-eared book, I began to feel that I was the Kazam to the book, an outgrowth of its mind. Naturally, it should have been the other way around. The book should have been my Kazam, a projection of my psyche. But this wasn't my book. It was my mother's book. Her second novel was also her last. Published when she was 70, the year she died. I don't know how she did it, but she managed to get a major house to publish the thing even though she didn't have an agent. Senior citizen professor's privilege, I guess. She taught at a community college. It was what she wanted and it was good enough for her. Community college was good enough for Random House too. The book, as it happens, is very good. After a while I watched a cluster of artsy types stroll up the center aisle of the bookstore to the lobby area and the back, where I was sitting, on the stool now, with my mother's book in my lap, drinking black coffee. The bookstore had no milk. They came in trying to look like they weren't together, managing the appearance of a horse trying to get mud off its hoof and shaking in all directions at once. A body against itself. I thought of the store owner's hair again and the wrinkles like scars on her face, and my mind said, Kazam. We all exchanged greetings. Some of them had read the book. Some of them hadn't. The group was made up of friends of the bookstore and they would have come to hear anyone read. They would have come to hear someone read from a book on the Flintstones. Hell, they would have come to hear me read from one of my books. I didn't have any. Was there a reason for me coming to this bookstore on a book tour, reading a book that I hadn't written? The idea of reason carries an implication of mind, my mother said. She didn't believe in reason as the coordinating force behind the events of the world. My mother believed that there were cause and effect explanations. There was no mind behind it at all. She believed in a great chain of accidents that made the world the way it was. I have a mind, though, so there could be a reason behind me coming to this cramped used bookstore. Then again, I am an organic creature, full of history and episodes of history that I also did not author. My mother would say, if she were alive, that these histories authored me. As much as I might tell myself that I have a reason for taking up the torch of my mother's work, she would say that I am applying reason like paint over the real mechanisms of cause and effect that put me on this stool, trying not to spill coffee on myself. At bottom, there was an explanation for my actions, hidden in the intricacies of personal history and impersonal history, something that a super-complex God-mind might tease out but which humans are forced to accept or reject without understanding, since we are not gods and we cannot penetrate the mystery. We are merely complex. Two young people meet on Ensuite-Dappled Avenue in Paris 3 decades ago. By chance, a moment of distraction causes a fatal accident, and I shake hands in a stuffy bookstore. My palms sweat into the binding of my mother's magnum opus. To see things like this takes away a certain magic from the world. Mother said, there is still the mystery. There is still the mystery of how everything comes together and how everything falls apart. And people participate in the mystery this way. And she said that everything being connected in this chain of accident was uplifting and dignified. I can see what she meant, sometimes, but I have never agreed. The chairs for the audience were half filled and the owner of the shop decided that was good enough. I flipped to the first dog-eared section and put my finger between the pages. I introduced myself and my mother's book, 'cause I'm addressing an audience. Here are the thoughts and here is the work of my dear, dead friend Fred Flintstone. Do not consider these as words from the grave. He wrote them living, for the living, we, the ageless, the projections of humanity, riding the shoulders of the dead, goading them still into action, reading their words like incantation in the thick-used air of old bookstores, defying the changes that nature demands, death, advance, a crumbling of the walls of culture. I recite here the demands, in the coffin of this spent air, smothered in the breath and heat of these, our bodies. I recite the demands of a dead friend, that we age only by choice and hover here, perhaps forever, aliens on this planet, hover over the carved stone marker of the departed, reading out the words of the dead.